Hey, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the asynchronous today. Today we are looking at Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, in his work Philosophy of Right. We are looking at a very small portion of that work, which is Hegel's section on reason in history. And because we've already looked at Immanuel Kant and his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, and we looked at Ernst Haeckel with the riddle of the universe, we're really looking at Hegel today in the context of those previous two thinkers. And we're continuing to look at what the Enlightenment had to say about very important categories of thought. We already looked at what it had to say about nature. We looked at what it had to say about knowledge and how knowledge is organized. And so today, with Hegel, with Reason and History, we're looking at a new conception of time that the Enlightenment proposed. Yeah, so let's get right into it. I'm going to pull up my screen. Okay. Okay, so Hegel is right in the 18th century, end of the 18th century, right at the time uh, that the Enlightenment begins. Enlightenment begins around the 1750s in the realm of ideas, alongside other phenomena that are happening, as we've mentioned a few times in class. So, right around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and there are changes taking place to the material conditions of life for the vast majority of peasants across Europe. Europe is transitioning from a feudal economic system to a mercantilist economic system. The towns and cities are exploding. The common lands have been enclosed so that peasants who live on large feudal estates don't have a means of providing for themselves independently outside of what they owe to the lords and barons and baronesses of the feudal estates. A lot of changes going on. 1700s, Europe is also already deep into its colonies in the Americas. We had the first wave of imperialism from Spain and Portugal, sailing around the southern tip of Africa, sailing to the so-called New World, to the Americas, to the Atlantic world. And because Spain and Portugal are going to pillage so much of the gold and silver in the Americas and bring it back to Europe, they're going to upset the economic balance of powers among the European states. So the continuation of European imperialism and what it ultimately became had to do really with an intra-European economic competition. So all of these things are happening, right? When Hobbes and Locke were writing about the state of nature, this was occurring in real time as European monarchs were encountering the natives and the indigenous people of other lands. So their interpretation, and we see this when we study American political thought and we look at the writings of some of the founding fathers, they are very explicitly naming the Americas as the state of nature. And they're saying that, it's their job now to create something out of this pristine virgin land that has not been subdued by the natives here and so on. But we won't get too much into that. Let's focus instead on the Enlightenment and on Hegel. So in this work, Hegel is providing us in the small six-page excerpt from the very end of Philosophy of Right. Hegel is giving us a timeline of human development. So history, what is history for Hegel? History is the development of consciousness of freedom. So history moving forward in time is the human being as a species, not just individuals. Remember what Kant said is the telos of human life, the ultimate goal or purpose. The telos for Kant was, the realization of reason altogether as a species. Now, reason and freedom go hand in hand in the Enlightenment. So as well as morality, that we saw with our lesson on Kant, that for Kant, the more reasonable a person is, the more moral they will behave, and the more moral you behave, the more reasonable you are behaving. For Hegel, we bring in the concept of freedom. So this becomes a triangle. And all three of these, reason, freedom, and morality, although Hegel's focus is less on morality than it is on reason and freedom, but all three of these positively correlate. As one goes up, the others go up. As one goes down, the other goes down. So in this work, Hegel is providing us with a definition of history as the development of the consciousness of freedom. So the more human beings develop their understanding and their awareness of freedom, and the more free they become, that's how you know history is moving forward. And that's actually how you can map different civilizations, according to Hegel, on this singular universal timeline of human history. That's why we say with the Enlightenment, history with a capital H, not with a lowercase h, because if it was lowercase, it would be multiple. This country has history, the other country has history. Yes, there's such a thing as world history, but it's made up of a number of component histories. Not true for the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment not only said, and we went over this with Kant, that there's only one single way to be rational, universal rationality or universal reason, but they also said there's only one human history, universal history. Now, let's get into it and then we'll be able to see if it was truly universal or if it was particularly European, particularly Germanic, continental, right, at a specific moment in its own history, and particularly full of hubris in terms of one civilization looking out onto the wide expanse of other civilizations. So he gives us stages. Remember, and we saw this with Ernst Haeckel in The Riddle of the Universe, that the Enlightenment was, as a philosophy, right, as a philosophical movement, was heavily influenced by biological sciences and advances in the chemical and the other natural sciences. Science is going to heavily influence this philosophy. And one of the ways we see that in Hegel's work is the concept of stages and maturation, right? That's a biological concept that life and organisms that they progress along stages and they are aiming at a telos, at an ultimate goal. And according to that telos, wherever they are, at whatever stage they are along that journey, that's how you know how mature they are, how much they have achieved maturation towards the telos. So let's start with the first stage. Hegel tells us that the first stage of human history, where history is the development of the consciousness of freedom, is the Oriental phase. China and India would be the exemplars here. Those are very ancient civilizations, for those who may not know. But according to Hegel, these were stationary civilizations. They reached their height and then they just leveled off, right? There was no development after a particular time. For Hegel, this constitutes prehistory. Okay. Um, Now, when we say prehistory, we mean historical periods in which writing did not occur or written records have not come down to us. That's what we consider prehistory. But if any civilization had writing and that writing has reached us, we consider that to be part of the fold of history proper. So we do know that ancient China and ancient India were literate civilizations and they did have writing, which can be archaeologically studied. So technically that wouldn't be correct to say now, but Hegel is referring to it in a different way. In Oriental society, says Hegel, only one person is free, and that's the ruler. So the ruler rules by arbitrary will, and the subjects, the citizens, right, of that empire, they don't have a will of their own. So they're just all subjected to the ruler. Therefore, if history is the development of the consciousness of freedom, and in the Oriental phase only one person is free, then this is like a very early stage in that development, right? In the Oriental phase, the first major development, according to Hegel, is the Persian Empire. And that is because Zoroaster, the Zoroastrian religion believes that there are two gods, God of light and God of darkness. So it's a dualistic religion. And even though the emperor remains in a position of absolute rule during this time in the Persian Empire, his rule is based on a principle. So for Hegel, this is the first development because the ruler is not ruling by arbitrary will alone, but rather the ruler himself is subject to a broader or more general principle, which is the principle of the worship of light. So this allows development to begin, right? We had mentioned in the last class that there's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Thesis is a general claim or statement of fact. Antithesis is its opposite. It's the contending force or the contradiction. And synthesis is when thesis and antithesis battle it out and they come to some kind of a conclusion, building something new. And that new thing is the synthesis of the two pieces and it becomes the new thesis. And the cycle begins again. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. For Hegel, this is how history progresses. So this moment in the Persian Empire with the subjection of the ruler's arbitrary will to the principle of the Zoroaster religion, this allows the first movement to happen, the first development from thesis to antithesis, the beginning of the growth of the consciousness of freedom and the beginning of true history, according to Hegel. Now, we'll get to this other point here in a second, the guiding role of Geist. We'll talk about that in a moment, so just hold on to that. The next stage in the development of history is the Greek phase. And here, and Hegel is referring to antiquity, right? Classical ancient Greek history, the city-states, Athens, Sparta, and all that. And here Hegel observes that we have a free individuality, but it's not yet fully developed. So even though you have democracy, Athenian democracy, you do have slaves, you do have foreigners who come and they don't have the same rights as citizens. Slavery is allowed during this time. We know this because Aristotle, I'm sorry, because Socrates in Republic, what is the plot of Republic? He's walking around asking everyone he meets, what is justice? This is how the Republic opens. And when people provide him with an answer, he dialectically follows it to its conclusion. He deconstructs their answers. He shows them that the definition of justice is faulty, right? And then he goes on to supply a definition of justice. And the Republic is a work that um, in support of his answer, right? And with the very social, practical instructions on how to run a city state in order to achieve the definition of justice that Socrates provides, which we'll get to in our class on Plato. But how was Socrates able to do all of that? It's because he had slaves at home working, right? Women in Athenian society were not as free as men. So even though you have individuality in the Greek city-states, it's not yet perfected, it's not yet fully developed. So some people were free, but not all. So this is a development of the consciousness of freedom, but it's still incomplete. You also have, as Hegel is pointing out, certain customary moral norms that take away from true freedom. For example, if somebody in Athens has a life problem or they have a burning question, they go and they ask an oracle. An oracle, what other civilizations called medicine men or medicine women, you know, what other civilizations and traditions refer to as prophets or and others still as seers are people who have some kind of a connection, not rational, outside of the realm of just rationality, with the transcendent realm and with transcendent truth. So the ability to ask an oracle for advice is proof for Hegel that the Greek phase of history, even though it was more advanced than the Oriental, that it was still stuck in a rather meager development of the consciousness of freedom. Freedom can't be fully achieved without critical thought and reflection. So now we go to the next phase, and the next phase is the Roman phase. Now, we already spent a whole class and a half or two talking about the Roman world state and looking at some of the ideas of the radical individualism and the cosmic disinterest in the destiny of man, and this kind of very thin allegiance to the imperial state without any connection or community, which is why Christianity was so successful. Christianity supplied the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood to a society that was completely lacking in any such bonds. So we already have a bit of a preview about the Roman world state and some of the political thought there. But here, what Hegel is telling us is that there was a severe discipline that was required, and it was backed up by the brute force of the Roman world state. So it's true that the citizens of the Roman world state were legal persons in the law, but the freedom was largely abstract. So concrete individuality was ruthlessly crushed in terms of being able to develop a diversity of ways of being in the world. There was a tension between the absolute power of the state and the ideal of the individual. So the state needed outward conformity, and the freedom was found in retreating within yourself. And you may recall that when we did our lesson on the Roman world state, we said that the most robust part of the individual was the interior life of man, right? There wasn't much out here worth celebrating, but if one could retreat into their own mind, into their own heart, that was rich. The end of the Roman state, as you know, Christianity, this is the age of martyrs, and the Roman world state is ruthlessly crushing the Christians at this time, and Christianity ultimately overpowers the Roman world state, and the number of believers just grows and grows. For Hegel, the development of Christianity at the end of the Roman world period marks a very significant development. Why? because Christianity proposed that human beings live in two realms simultaneously, not just in the historical realm here in the life of society, but also in a transcendental spiritual realm, right? And we know this because we studied St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine of Hippo, and we learned from those Christian theologians that what's possible in history is not the same as what's possible in eternity. And we learned about the city of God and the city of man, right, which is the magnum opus of St. Augustine of Hippo. And we learned that there was a new belonging that Christianity brought to the people of the Roman world state. So for Hegel, this is a development because it's religious self-consciousness. It recognizes that the spiritual, not the natural world, is our true home. And the limitations on freedom become abolished. So slavery, depending on the oracle, and customary morality, kind of some of what we would call superstitious, all of this gets replaced by the spiritual love offered in Christianity. So this is a further development. Now, the Germanic worldview is the last stage, right? And the Reformation is the single most important event for Hegel. Why is it so important? Well, not only because there was corruption in the church and, the money that parishioners were paying churches for their salvation, that this was, a form of corruption, but also because people depended on outward objects in order to fulfill their spiritual life and their spiritual obligations. Meaning what? Meaning that to eat the biscuit and drink the wine symbolically, to consume the flesh and the blood of Christ, that this was a form of not fully developed reason, right? What did the Reformation do? Why is it so important for Hegel? The Reformation took the concept of salvation and it wrestled it away from the ecumenical hierarchy of the church, and it wrestled it away from these embodied, what some would call superstitious practices, right, of consuming the blood and the flesh of Christ. And what did it do? It dropped it into the realm of the individual's consciousness. This is a huge development in freedom and the consciousness of freedom as well as in rationality. Hegel says that for people to fulfill their spiritual nature, they don't just have to perfect their religious life, but they also have to make the world suitable for free spiritual beings. And the Reformation helped to do that. So the Reformation claimed that every human being can recognize the truth of his or her nature and can achieve their own salvation. No outside authority is needed. That's what makes it a further development in the consciousness of freedom. Individual conscience is the ultimate judge of truth and goodness. And that is actually what the meaning behind the Reformation. Man by nature is destined to be free. Since the Reformation, history has only been transforming the world in accordance with this principle. So let's talk a little bit about the guiding role of Geist. Geist is spirit, right? Spirit with a capital S, but not in a Christian sense, not when we think about the Trinity in Christianity and we think of the Spirit as the Holy Spirit. That's not what this is referring to. Geist here is, I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with Carl Jung, the psychologist, and he had a concept of Wotan, Wotan, which he was writing, and he's witnessing the scourges of war, and there has to be an explanation for that, for all of the carnage that he's seeing all around him. But he goes back into the ancient Greek, ancient German mythology, and this is similar to what Machiavelli did when he went back, when he skipped over a couple of hundred years of Christianity, went back to ancient Rome and dug Fortuna out of the cemetery and brought her to the forefront. Carl Jung goes back and he brings out Wotan, who is this ancient German spirit or god of chaos and war, right? And it's part of his analytical framework for the psyche and all of this. Geist is a spirit that guides the historical process. Geist is the spirit that has to be fulfilled, and it fulfills itself through the dialectical movement of history, through the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, through the stages of maturation of human rationality. Geist is the guiding principle. Now, any human being who is in keeping with the Geist is moving in the right direction, and any human being who is not in keeping with the Geist is not in the right direction. So any human being that is in keeping with Geist is moving in the right direction of history. Anybody who's not is moving in the wrong direction of history. So let us continue. So all social institutions must conform to general principles of reason. And here in Hegel's Reason and History, we are getting to the prescriptions that he's going to give to the state. The state is objectified Geist. When we do in a few weeks Karl Marx, and we see that Marx, we're going to begin with Marx's reply to Hegel, right? Marx as a materialist, his real problem is with Hegel as an idealist. Hegel is starting with the spirit, Geist, and he's saying that the state is objectified Geist. So the state has to embody the spirit of Geist and then act accordingly, moving in the proper direction of the development of the consciousness of freedom, and creating all of the institutions that will allow that to happen. For Marx, this is going to be the opposite. For Marx, it's a bottom-up approach. He doesn't believe in anything he can't see and touch or that's invisible. He doesn't believe in spirit or Geist like that. He just believes in the material conditions of society. And we'll get to that when we get to him. But just suffice it to say that Geist is the most important part of the development of history, and the state has to become the concrete version of Geist, has to embody and resemble the motives and the objective of Geist as it creates its institutions in society. The rational community is a constitutional monarchy. This is his prescription. You know, Hobbes gave his prescription, and Locke gave his prescription, and Machiavelli gave his prescription, and this is Hegel's. So, constitutional monarchy is the most rational way of organizing a state form. A state is not just a government, but it's all social life. And he gives a very strong defense of the rule of law. So, in that sense, this is a little bit Kantian, where we know that in order to uphold morality as a system, society has to create certain incentives and certain deterrences, right? So Hegel is suggesting something similar when he says that the state is not just a government, but it's all social life. If the state is embodied Geist, it is very important that it be very involved in creating institutions and policies that will guide people and push them in the right direction. Absolute knowledge is true freedom, knowledge of the world as it really is rather than of appearances. And this happens when the mind realizes that really what it wants to understand is itself. So between the human being and Geist, there is like a knowledge by correspondence, like a direct apprehension, if a person is willing to embody the spirit of the development of freedom. And here, I'm going to have you guys just watch this video, which is by Pearl Jam. It's called Do the Evolution. I want you to listen to the lyrics, and I want you to watch the video because the iconography, the animation is very important to the storytelling, but also do make sure that you are, like, turn on your closed captioning, you know, because Eddie Vedder tends to mumble a little bit, and you're gonna read those lyrics as well. What I'm asking you to look at here, we've got the Hegelian view of history, which says that history moved from less complex to more. Right? This is evolution put into the theory of history. That we started from something simple and we've gotten more complex, that we started incomplete and we matured to full maturation. Really, we've reached the end of history with Hegel's conception. And human beings have all matured, right? If you're not on the progress train, you got to hop on. If you belong to one of those backwards countries that's still in the state of nature, you need to jump on the example of the European exemplars because they were the first to reach the final stage. So there's an idea that as we move forward in time, progress is increasing, development is increasing, always new, always improved, infinitely. This is the theory of infinite progress. This is the teleological ascension that the Enlightenment speaks of. This video by Pearl Jam, Do the Evolution, is giving us a different conception of history and the movement of history. And what I'd like you to be prepared to speak about in class next time is how is this video different from what Hegel has espoused? Actually, I think I'm going to end up assigning that for today, and that'll count as your attendance for today. After you review the notes, and you watch this video, you're going to do a quick write-up about how this conception of history differs in important ways from Hegel's. And that's it for today's lesson on Hegel and Reason and History. We will pick up next time with a closing discussion on the Enlightenment before we move into our unit on District 9. Take care, guys.